scientists sets the doomsday clock.
The so-called doomsday clock.
Doomsday clock.
The doomsday clock.
The doomsday clock.
The clock is a metaphor for estimating humanity's proximity to catastrophe. In 2023, the bulletin set the clock at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to disaster it has ever been, citing the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, and cyber-enabled disinformation. In 2024, the time was held at 90 seconds to midnight. The bulletin traces its origins back to the Manhattan Project and the scientists who hoped to warn the world about the dangers of their creation. The clock was introduced in 1947 and originally set at 7 minutes to midnight. The bulletin has been setting the clock for more than 75 years. Originally, the bulletin focused primarily on nuclear risk, but as technology advanced and human impacts on the planet became more pronounced, the scope of coverage expanded. Today, the bulletin is focused on reducing the threats posed by nuclear weapons, climate change, and the potential misuse of biological science and other disruptive technologies. In setting the doomsday clock, the bulletin's Science and Security Board asked themselves two questions. Is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to last year? And how does this year compare to the more than 75 years we have been asking the question? So let's take a look at 2024. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a Japanese organization of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
Nihon Hidankyu,
who have worked for 70 years to warn against the danger of nuclear weapons. The world has developed a strong taboo against using nuclear weapons, but there are signs that taboo is beginning to weaken.
We've seen the collapse of arms control. The new start is a bilateral arms control agreement between the US and Russia. But this, unless it's extended, is going to expire in 2026. And there are no negotiations going on between the two of them, given the political state that they are in.
And nuclear weapon states are investing heavily in modernizing their arsenals.
There's some obvious things like the war in Ukraine, and there have been threats to use nuclear weapons, so that's extremely alarming.
Right from the time that Russia first undertook the invasion in Ukraine, it was with a fair bit of nuclear saber rattling.
Of course, there are other wars. The Middle East is very unstable.
We've seen North Korea, Pakistan, as well as China, Pakistan, China, North Korea, and Russia thrown in as important players in proliferation, helping each other on their nuclear programs.
A lot of the rhetoric is really disturbing, and so there's this growing sense that we might end up, some nation might end up using nuclear weapons, and that's terrifying.
Investments in renewable energy continue to increase, and renewables continue to dominate new energy deployment.
The adoption of renewables is really encouraging.
However, it wasn't enough to slow the ongoing impacts of climate change.
I apologize. This is just horrific.
It's still one of these things where it's not happening quite fast enough, and the urgency just isn't there, and the threat is increasing. The last year was the hottest year on record.
2023 was 1.45 degrees Celsius, more or less 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And that doesn't sound like very much. It's a couple of degrees on a given day is no big deal. But the planet being that much warmer has these global effects. The average projections about the end of the century sea level rise are maybe 2 or 3 feet, which is plenty to have to invest to retreat, to build barriers and so forth. We have our hands full. But it keeps coming.
Almost all the indicators are bad, and even worse than many scientists expected. It's really a very frightening time on climate, and we're just not doing enough.
The COVID-19 pandemic caused unimaginable global suffering, but the emergence of mRNA vaccines was an enormous technological and logistical achievement.
The scientific community mobilized to develop a vaccine that was viable to fight the pandemic, and local and state governments mobilized to do everything that they could to ensure that their residents had access to the vaccine, access to information and education that could help them better protect themselves, their families, and their communities. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 took a lot out of our public health system. Our public health leadership walked away from that situation demoralized.
We didn't completely fail, but as a society, it was an enormous, hugely disruptive and divisive event.
While the public health system is still recovering from the last pandemic, a new strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza has been appearing in farm animals and dairy products.
I'm not quite sure that we're ready to face another pandemic at this point.
Meanwhile, high-containment biolaboratories studying dangerous pathogens continue to proliferate around the world.
What we are seeing now is the development of laboratories where people are researching these pathogens, trying to identify whether or not there is dual use for any of these pathogens, whether the dual use is a positive one or a negative one.
Technological innovations like the rise of generative AI have rekindled great power competition, which is increasingly occurring in space, where Chinese, Russian, and US actions are raising tensions. Complicating this dynamic is the growing involvement of the private sector.
The private sector is taking this over. It's taking over a lot of space-based capabilities. It's reducing costs by a lot. It's bringing innovation into the space sector a lot faster. And so our launch capabilities now are not all, but mostly done by the private sector. And we're buying more and more space-based capability for things like communications. And then there's an interesting question of what happens if those companies that we rely on for these capabilities are controlled by private parties.
While there are efforts underway to regulate artificial intelligence and limit its potential for harm, many countries are incorporating AI into their military structure, and corruption of the information system through AI-generated content could hamper efforts to address threats like nuclear risk, climate change, and pandemics.
I used to believe that we believe in reason and reality as the foundations of discourse, that you could make an argument with somebody, you could reason with them, you could use logic and so on. And empirical reality, what actually is happening out there.
Scientists, I'm one of them, used to be trusted. We tried to tell the truth. We had a reputation for telling the truth, even when it wasn't a truth that people particularly wanted to hear.
We're moving into an environment in which reason and reality are replaced by rage and fantasy. We can't even agree now on a set of facts, let alone a solution, if you're not all pulling together in the same direction. And if your job is to undermine me and my job is to undermine you, clearly you can't make any progress at all in that kind of environment. And the problems that we have today are really, really hard to solve.
Thank you all for being here today. It is the determination of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that the world has not made sufficient progress on existential risks threatening all of humanity. We thus move the clock forward. In setting the clock closer to midnight, we send a stark signal. Because the world is already perilously close to the precipice, any move towards midnight should be taken as an indication of extreme danger and an unmistakable warning. Every second of delay in reversing course increases the probability of global disaster. It is now 89 seconds to midnight. This is the closest the world has ever been to midnight. Joining us to make this announcement are members of the Science and Security Board, Herb Lynn, Suzette McKinney, Robert Sokolow, and Manpreet Sethi, joining from India. We also welcome special guest Juan Manuel Santos, the former President of Colombia, Nobel Peace Laureate, and the Chair of the Elders. My name is Daniel Holtz, and I am the Chair of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We set the clock closer to midnight because we do not see sufficient positive progress on the global challenges we face, including nuclear risk, climate change, biological threats, and advances in disruptive technologies. The countries that possess nuclear weapons are increasing the size and role of their arsenals, investing hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons that can destroy civilization many times over. Meanwhile, arms control treaties are in tatters, and there are active conflicts involving nuclear powers. The world's attempts to deal with climate change remain inadequate, as most governments fail to enact the financing and policy initiatives necessary to halt global warming. 2023 was the hottest year on record, by far, and 2024 was even hotter. Advances in an array of disruptive technologies, including biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and in space, have far outpaced policy, regulation, and a thorough understanding of their consequences. All of these dangers are greatly exacerbated by a potent threat multiplier: the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories that degrade the communication ecosystem and increasingly blur the line between truth and falsehood. A statement summarizing these concerns is now available at thebulletin.org. All of us need to help raise the alarm. Our fervent hope is that our political, civic, cultural, and business leaders take bold action to reduce these threats and turn back the hands of the doomsday clock. Before we turn to questions from the press, I'd like to ask the former President of Colombia, Nobel Peace Laureate, and current Chair of the Elders, Juan Manuel Santos, to share his perspective on the time of the doomsday clock.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This clock is a stark diagnosis of our reality. At 89 seconds to midnight, the doomsday clock stands closer to catastrophe than at any moment in its history. The clock speaks to the existential threats that confront us and the need for unity and bold leadership to turn back its hands. 2024 was the hottest year on record, unleashing devastating climate shocks that destroyed lives and livelihoods across the globe. The only effective response is for nations to work together, which is why it is so alarming that President Trump has signaled his intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. In this crucial year for climate action, we urge all other signatories to double down and reaffirm their commitment to meeting the Paris goals. The climate crisis is a force multiplier for instability and insecurity, amplifying the likelihood and severity of all other existential threats. The increase in outbreaks of infectious diseases we are already seeing is a dire indication that this deadly cascade effect has already begun. The U.S. announcement that it will withdraw from the World Health Organization is another worrisome decision that will have huge ramifications for the global health security. We all need a strong, independent, and accountable WHO to ensure successful reforms to pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response measures worldwide. We also need urgent actions to tackle the torrent of misinformation and the amplifications of conspiracy theories that have become so prevalent in our hyper-connected online world. This alarming rise in distrust is being fueled in large part by the malicious and reckless use of new technologies we do not yet fully understand. Artificial intelligence is racing ahead of our ability to govern it, despite the adoption of the Global Digital Compact at last year's UN Summit of the Future. AI's integration into military systems brings us to the precipice of new and unprecedented danger: automated warfare in a world where states locked in deep rivalry collectively possess over 12,000 nuclear warheads. As we prepare to mark the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the threat of nuclear conflict is at its highest level ever. The New START Treaty, the last remaining restraint on U.S. and Russian nuclear deployments, is set to expire in 1 year. This is another example of the erosion of the rules and norms underpinning the multilateral system, as nations prioritize self-interest and cynicism over the collective interest of humanity. I welcome President Trump's remarks in Davos about his desire to engage in talks with Russia and China to reduce the nuclear stockpile. He is right that the destructive capability of these weapons does not bear thinking about, and that they cost a tremendous amount of money. I hope it follows through. To those countries who want to see an end to the madness of nuclear proliferation, which has seen a 34% increase in spending in the last 5 years on nuclear weapons, with trillions more planned that could be spent on saving our planet or reducing poverty. I urge you to sign the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Half of all the countries have signed it, so it has momentum. We also mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations in 2025, and leaders must reflect on how far the world has strayed from the UN's founding principles. This is a bleak picture, but it is not yet irreversible. There is a big chance that this time next year we will be moving the hands of the clock back, not forward. But this will only happen if leaders engage in good faith dialogue. And recalling the words of Nelson Mandela, the founder of the Elders, the most powerful weapon in the world is to sit down and talk. The solutions we need to confront the existential threats we face are all connected by a simple truth: we can only succeed if we act as one. It is with great sadness that just a few weeks ago we said farewell to a true champion of this ideal, President Jimmy Carter, a founding member of the Elders. President Carter was driven by a profound moral clarity, so sorely missing among many leaders today. And in the weeks since I attended his funeral here in Washington, I have often been reminded of his words. The bond of our common humanity is stronger than the divisiveness of our fears and prejudices. To translate this vision into concrete reality, we need leadership that addresses even the most difficult and unpopular issues, not for short-term political gain, but for humanity's shared future. there is still time to make the right choices to turn back the hands of the doomsday clock. In Colombia, we say, cada segundo cuenta. Every second counts. Let us use each one wisely. I thank you.
Thank you, President Santos. The opening video featured prepared statements from colleagues seated here. We will now open the floor to your questions.
Please wait for the microphone. Hi, good morning. Davis Winky, USA Today. The Trump administration last night issued an executive order directing the U.S. Defense Department to focus on accelerating the development of strategic defense systems. Arms control advocates have previously argued that developing such systems has a destabilizing effect on the balance of nuclear power. I want to ask if anybody up at the podium would like to comment on the administration's moves regarding strategic defense investments and whether there's anything else we should be keeping an eye on. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll pass that to Manpreet.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it is such a privilege to be joining all of you, even if it's from thousands of kilometers away. So on the question of President Trump's latest executive order, ballistic missile defenses and their development of various systems has been a part of the US strategy for quite some time. And I don't think this is something which is very new. In fact, what has been happening is that US withdrawal from the ABM treaty set us off on a path of an offense-defense spiral, and we are living through the results of that today, where different countries are responding to what those systems are. You know, nuclear deterrence is built on the idea of mutual vulnerability, and if one side is able to show that it can defend itself while also undertaking first strike, it becomes a problem for stability, as you just mentioned. So I'm hoping President Trump has the tendency to surprise us all with his actions. In the Davos meeting, as was mentioned, he did mention denuclearization, and now this is the executive order that has been taken. I think it's going to take some time for things to stabilize. So for now, we take it as part of the negative trends that we were trying to show and what motivated us then to move the doomsday clock by 1 second. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Mocha.
Tim and Wallace from Presenza. Thank you so much, President Santos, for your remarks and for all of you. We're obviously living in very dangerous and scary times, and we know that. But I'm just wondering if you could comment, any of you, on where we go from here to move the clock back, because you mentioned the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and half the countries of the world are now party to that. That's a hopeful sign. Most recently, Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world. You also mentioned President Trump's remarks at Davos. I just wonder if there are other things that you could share with us about that could be steps that we can be looking out for that show that we're moving in the right direction.
I'll say, this brings up an important point here, which is that I think among all of us, there is hope. We certainly believe that the clock can be moved back, and there are many actions that can be taken. Our concern is that over the past year, those actions are not being taken. But as you've mentioned, there are many specific things on all the areas that we cover where there could be clear progress. And maybe what I'll do is I'll leave it to colleagues if they want to comment on anything in particular.
Well, on climate, the Paris Treaty was created to generate a race to the top. Countries would compete to show they were doing something and elicit the behavior of others. To withdraw from that is exactly in the wrong direction unless people unite in showing us, the U.S., that they can do it without us, which could be a way things might happen this year. It's certainly the wrong way to go from an American perspective.
Yuichiro Inoguchi for Kyoto News. Thank you for doing this. As mentioned in the video, last year's Nobel Peace Prize went to Japanese atomic bomb survivors organization, Nihon Hidankyo. And did you take it into consideration when you were discussing about this year's doomsday clock? And can we have your comment on how much they can influence on the global nuclear debate? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I will say that the issues underlying that Nobel Award are certainly issues that we consider. There is this sense that the world is sort of forgetting the horrors of nuclear weapons, that there's this presumption that that's in the past and that it's no longer a concern. And I think many people around the world are worried because these weapons still exist. They're still poised to annihilate the planet in a matter of minutes, 30 minutes. And so that threat is not in the past, it's ever present. And I think the Nobel Award was to remind us and to kind of draw the world's attention to this. And in that sense, we're very aligned in our concern and our desire to kind of reduce these risks.
And I would add that as a Nobel laureate, also the Nobel Committee was very, very relevant in awarding the Nobel Peace Prize last year to the survivors of the Holocaust. And it is among many reasons, one of the reasons why the elders, we're going to have our board meeting next May in Hiroshima. Because, as was said, we want to remind the world that this threat is not diminished, on the contrary, has increased in the last years.
Hi, I'm Steve Herman from Voice of America. President Santos, you welcomed President Trump's remark about denuclearization talks. What do you see as the biggest challenge for Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping actually making progress towards some sort of new arms control agreement?
Well, the biggest challenge, in my view, is for them to understand that they should sit down, talk, and talk about how the three of them can take decisions to save their own countries and the whole world. In a way that President Kennedy, when we were in a crisis, took the phone and called counterpart in Russia, sat down, and reached an agreement that, as a matter of fact, turned the clock backwards a few minutes. So I think something of that sort must be initiated right now, and you need to talk, to have bold leadership. Go, take the phone, call the other leaders, sit down, and agree on something that is almost common sense. Because to continue on this race is counterproductive for everybody.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Joshua Keating. I write for Vox. I was wondering if you could comment on the risks of a return to nuclear testing. We've seen Russia withdraw from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Several figures in President Trump's orbit have proposed a resumption of live testing as opposed to computer modeling. I'm wondering if you talk about the likelihood of that and the risks it would pose if countries did go back to real live tests.
Yeah, thanks. I'll pass that to Mundo.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And if I may just begin with one sentence on the previous question as well. I think Ambassador Santos has said very rightly what the challenge will be. To my mind, the challenge will also be perseverance and patience, because these are going to be difficult negotiations, and it's important for the leaders to stay invested in this process over a long period of time, and that's, I think, going to be a challenge given the slightly flitty nature of current times. On the question of nuclear testing, so there's been a chatter that we've heard from all of the major nuclear weapon states about keeping test sites ready and that there could be a process of testing. I think within the US, there are two camps, one which is pro-testing, but the other which tends to believe that if that testing door was opened by the US, other countries are going to follow, and the likelihood of their gaining from that process is going to be much more. So I'm hoping that wisdom will prevail and that we will not open this Pandora's box once again, because if the US was to set the fashion on the nuclear testing street, then there's every likelihood that other nations will also follow suit. So to keep the nuclear order in order, it's important not to go down the path of nuclear testing.
Yeah, and I'll add, one of the major accomplishments has been that we have not been testing. And this would be really a step in the wrong direction. And for those that think about these issues, it's exactly, the first step leading towards oblivion is to start to normalize these sorts of weapons.
Hi, I'm Jackson Barton with the Washington Post. So the clock has moved forward 1 second. That's a pretty relatively small move compared to past moves. So I'm just wondering, what does that 1 second signify if we're saying this is the highest risk we've been at in history? And have we considered, if the point of the clock is to communicate risk, if we considered other forms of communication, such as a percentage chance of nuclear war?
Yeah, thanks. So I think our main message here is we're already the closest we've ever been to midnight, and now the clock is moving forward. So when you're at this precipice, the one thing you don't want to do is take a step forward. And we're saying, given what's happened over the past year, we just haven't seen the sort of progress we need. And in some areas of concern, things have gotten worse, and therefore the clock is moving forward. So I think that is our main message. We are now the closest we've ever been to midnight.
Additional questions. So we have an additional question from offline. It's regarding disruptive technologies. How do the recently announced advances in Chinese artificial intelligence technologies affect geopolitics? Clock.
Herb?
I'll take that. One thing it indicates is that what many people have assumed, that is that the Americans have a firm and indestructible lead, just isn't true. And anybody who follows technology could have predicted that. That leads in technology, even if you try to hamper other people from catching up, they eventually dissipate, and it goes back and forth. And really the only way to, quote, stay ahead is to continue to do work and build on your technological strengths. So I think it affects geopolitics in that sense, that the Chinese have demonstrated, assuming you believe their press releases and so on, which isn't always the best thing to do, but assuming that the claims are valid, that that it's not a one-sided race anymore, that the United States can lose its lead, and Chinese innovators are smart and determined to make progress. We will learn from the Chinese inventions too, and we will get better as well. And you may see in the days and weeks and months to come that we do remarkable things too. But I think it's we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's always dangerous to predict that.
There's something quite positive about this development. If, and Herb can add to it, if we would need much less energy for the AI task, which is going to push our limits on energy sources seriously, if this development is correct, because it apparently uses considerably less energy to achieve the same high objectives. Is that right, Herb?
That's the claim, and we'll see what the actual data say.
And I might add, this is all part of this headlong race to develop AI, and there are concerns about potential risks from the development of AI, and as everyone rushes to beat each other and damn the consequences, that can be somewhat alarming. It's important that we also, as we're rushing here, that we also consider concerns that may arise with AI and kind of bring those along as well. And so one of the things that I think this leads to is this concern that people will just push as hard as they can and as fast as they can and not worry about consequences.
Emily Strasser, freelance. Thank you. I'm wondering if there were any conversations about changing the time in the last week since inauguration. A lot has happened in the world very quickly.
Yeah, so one thing about the doomsday clock is we don't attempt to be real time and respond to every tweet and adjust in the moment. Often many of these things take a while. The repercussions of some of the actions, even from the last week, will take a while to play out. And so I think for the we kind of have a theme and when we have our discussions, which is we wait for actions, not just words and intentions, but let's just see what the consequences are on the ground. And I think for many of the things that seem most alarming from the last week or have gotten so much attention, we're going to wait and see. But we'll continue to monitor over the weeks and months ahead. And if we need to change the clock, we will.
We have another question offline. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization at the start of his term. Then on Saturday said he would consider rejoining. What role does the World Health Organization play in biosecurity challenges that you describe?
Suzette?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So I think it's important to recognize the danger of the withdrawal from the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization serves as an expert and the leading authority really on protecting societies across the globe from infectious diseases. When infectious diseases occur, the World Health Organization works very closely with governments, particularly the U.S., in identifying not only how to protect communities and societies across the globe, but also treatment modalities for hospitals, testing modalities for laboratories. And so the role that the World Health Organization plays in biosecurity is significant, and we want to see continued support of those efforts by the U.S. as well as other nations. Thank you.
I would like to add, people forget the consequences of a pandemic. You go around the world right now, this is an issue that is not a priority for many people. We have to remind them what happened, and what will happen will be worse, according to all the scientists. And so it's so important for the world to prepare, because what is happening with other existential threats like climate change is increasing the possibility of another pandemic which will be worse than the last one. That is something that people should understand, leaders should understand. The agreement to design a system to prevent or protect the world from pandemics has not been finalized. The political will has not been there. The resources have not been there. But the danger is increasing. And that is what we have to transmit to the world, especially to the leaders of the countries that have not been committed enough to have an agreement finalized.
I would agree with that, and I would state that some of those dangers we're seeing already. There are people still suffering from long-term health effects of COVID-19. There are societies still trying to recover socially and economically from COVID-19. And most recently, we are seeing the spread of avian influenza, not just among birds, but jumping now to other mammals as well, with the grave concern that avian influenza could mutate to begin showing characteristics of sustained transmission among humans. And so the dangers that President Santos talks about are very real and extremely concerning at this point.
Yeah, and I might add, this is another one of the themes, which is all of these risks, they impact all of us. That's what we mean by existential risks. And the way we address them will require all of us. It's not that one nation unilaterally can solve climate change or can address all pandemics. We really need to work together, and so these sorts of international organizations play a major role in that. And so one of the themes in what we're talking about is that nations need to work together, that leaders need to talk and engage to address these sorts of existential risks.
Hi, Matthias Hammer with Semaphore here. I'm wondering, given the federal funding freeze announced earlier this week and last week, which touches a number of things, public health, I think some nuclear safety programming has been impacted. I'm wondering, in PEPFAR notably as well, HIV treatment, I'm wondering what kind of knock-on effects you guys would expect this to have, not just for the immediate short-term effects over the next few weeks, but also looking beyond that in terms of the credibility of some of these programs, stability, and the consequences of having these frozen, even just for a few weeks, or indefinitely. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Suzette?
So the first thing I would say is that the sustainability of our public health infrastructure here in the United States often depends on the availability of appropriate amounts of funding in order to continue to execute those public health programs, to continue research efforts that are ongoing. And so the freeze on funding currently, as well as the freeze on our governmental public health agencies' ability to communicate health concerns is gravely concerning. I hate to keep using that terminology, but it is in fact true. And so the danger that we see in the freezing of that funding at this point is that some public health programs could stop altogether, and other public health programs can be significantly impacted negatively because of the ability to not have the sustained funding that they need in order to continue. It's a big problem. What we're seeing right now with, as I mentioned a moment ago, the spread of avian influenza, just the inability of our federal government's public health agency to communicate with laboratories, to communicate with hospitals, and even to communicate with the public in terms of what they can and should be doing to protect themselves, what they should be concerned about, and what actions they should be taking along those lines, it stands to put us in real danger of not only this disease spreading, but seeing a lot more morbidity and mortality as a result.
one last question. In regards to AI and climate, what are your concerns with forecasted electricity demand growth for AI data centers, and how much did that influence this year's decision?
Well, I already dealt with that a bit by saying that the news from China may be very positive in this, beneficial in the sense that we'll use the specter of a lot of new energy demand coming from AI and the purchase of dedicated energy sources was